In the spring of 1945, American interrogators sat across from one of the most celebrated German generals of the war. Heinz Guderian had invented blitzkrieg. He had conquered Poland in weeks. He had shattered the French army and driven to the English Channel in days. He had pushed deeper into Russia than any commander in history. His panzer divisions had captured more prisoners in a single encirclement than any force in the history of warfare. Now he was a prisoner himself, answering questions about the men who had defeated him. The Americans asked Guderian what he thought of their generals. Most German officers gave dismissive answers. The Americans had won through industrial superiority, they said, through overwhelming numbers, through air power that made movement impossible. The quality of American generalship was rarely mentioned with anything resembling respect. When the interrogators mentioned George Patton, Guderian paused. Then he delivered a verdict that would have stunned anyone who knew how German officers typically regarded their enemies. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, Guderian said, I must congratulate him for his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place. The father of German armoured warfare had just declared that an American general fought exactly like him. This was not flattery from a defeated man seeking favour with his captors. Other captured German generals said the same thing independently, in separate interrogations without coordination. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations throughout the war, called Patton the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements, Jodl explained. He took big risks and won big successes. General Gunther Blumentritt went further. We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, he said. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. The Germans had spent years perfecting mobile armoured warfare. They had crushed every army that faced them, using techniques they believed only they truly understood. They had humiliated the Poles, the French, the British, the Soviets, and now their own experts were admitting that one American had mastered their methods and turned those methods against them with devastating effect. The question is how? How did a cavalry officer from California come to fight like the man who revolutionized warfare in the forests of Poland and the fields of France? How did two men who never met, never corresponded, and never faced each other in battle arrive at identical conclusions about how wars should be fought? The answer lies in parallel journeys through the same intellectual landscape, shaped by the same catastrophic lessons of the First World War. Heinz Guderian was born on June 17, 1888, in Kulm, a town that was then part of the German Empire. His father was a Prussian army officer, and young Heinz followed him into the military as expected of sons in such families. He attended cadet schools, earned his commission, and seemed destined for a conventional career in the Kaiser's army. The First World War changed everything. Guderian served as a signals officer and later as a staff officer, watching from headquarters as millions of men died in battles that moved the front lines by yards. The Western Front became a grave stretching from Switzerland to the sea. Traditional methods of warfare, massed infantry advancing against prepared positions supported by artillery, had produced nothing but mass graves. By 1918, Guderian had become obsessed with a question that haunted every military thinker who survived the trenches. How could the next war avoid the slaughter? There had to be another way to fight. There had to be a method that achieved decision without sacrificing entire generations to machine guns and barbed wire. He found his answer in the writings of two British theorists, J.F.C. Fuller and B.H. Liddell Hart. Both men had served in the First World War. Both had seen the tank appear on the battlefield in 1916 and 1917. Both understood that this new weapon could break the deadlock of trench warfare, but only if tanks were used correctly. The mistake most armies made was spreading tanks out among infantry units, using them as mobile artillery to support foot soldiers. Fuller and Liddell Hart argued for something radically different. Concentrate your tanks, mass them at a single point, punch through the enemy line and keep going. Do not stop to consolidate. Do not wait for the infantry to catch up. Drive deep into enemy territory, cut communications, destroy headquarters, spread chaos and panic faster than the enemy can respond. Guderian absorbed these ideas during the 1920s, while the German army secretly rebuilt itself in violation of the Versailles Treaty. He learned to drive tanks, learned their capabilities and limitations, learned what they could do when properly employed. He translated foreign texts on armored warfare into German. He wrote articles and gave lectures. He developed the concept that would make him famous. The Panzer Division was Guderian's creation. He combined tanks with motorized infantry that could keep pace with the armor. He added mobile artillery that could move forward with the advance instead of waiting for road repairs. He integrated combat engineers to bridge rivers and clear obstacles. And critically, he coordinated everything with close air support from the Luftwaffe. Every element could move at the speed of the tanks. Every element could fight together as a unified striking force. His superiors thought he was a dangerous radical. The German army was still dominated by traditionalists who believed in infantry and artillery, in careful advances and methodical operations. Guderian's ideas violated everything they had been taught. Tanks were supposed to support infantry, not replace it. Cavalry spirit belonged to horsemen, not machines. War was supposed to be orderly, not chaotic. Guderian did not care what his superiors thought. He had captured a truth about modern warfare that most of them were too blind to see. Hit with your fist, not with your fingers spread, he told his officers. Speed is everything. Attack speed is essential. The engine of the tank is as much a weapon as its gun. In 1937, he published his theories in a book called Achtung Panzer. The title meant attention tanks or warning tanks, a call to the German military establishment to recognize the revolutionary potential of armored warfare. The book was widely read in Germany. It would not be translated into English until 1992. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Guderian proved his theories in blood and steel. His 19th Panzer Corps spearheaded the assault, driving deep into Polish territory while the main German forces were still deploying. The speed was unprecedented. His tanks advanced over 300 kilometers in 10 days, losing only 8 of the 350 tanks employed, while capturing 16,000 prisoners. The Polish army could not comprehend what was happening. They had prepared for a war of infantry and cavalry, of defensive positions and deliberate maneuver. By the time they understood the threat Guderian represented, his tanks were already behind them, cutting their supply lines, surrounding their positions, creating panic in headquarters that had no idea where the enemy actually was. But Poland was a weak opponent with an outdated army. The real test came in May 1940 when Germany attacked France. The French army was considered the finest in Europe. France had won the First World War. France had built the Maginot Line, the most formidable defensive fortification in history, a continuous barrier of concrete and steel stretching from Switzerland to Belgium. French generals had studied the lessons of 1914 to 1918 and believed they understood how to fight a modern defensive campaign. They had more tanks than Germany. They had comparable artillery. They had the advantage of defending prepared positions. They were wrong about everything. The German plan called for an attack through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French considered impassable for armoured forces. While German armies in the north drew French and British forces into Belgium, the main blow would fall through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and cut behind the Allied armies from an unexpected direction. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps received what seemed like an impossible assignment: cross the Meuse at Sedan, breach the French defensive line, and open a corridor for the German advance. The crossing point was defended by well-prepared French troops supported by artillery. The Meuse was a serious obstacle, wide and deep enough to stop armoured vehicles. Military doctrine said such a river crossing required careful preparation, massed artillery bombardment, and methodical infantry assault over several days at minimum. Guderian had no time for doctrine. On May 13, 1940, at 3:20 in the afternoon, German infantry began crossing the Meuse in rubber boats while Stuka dive bombers screamed down on French positions. The air attack was relentless, wave after wave of aircraft keeping the French defenders pinned, while the infantry paddled across. Within hours, combat engineers had constructed a pontoon bridge strong enough to bear tanks. By nightfall, armour was rolling across. The French counterattacks came too late and too weak. Units that should have sealed the breach were out of position. Reserves that should have crushed the bridgehead were committed elsewhere. The coordination that defensive warfare requires had collapsed under the shock of Guderian's assault. What happened next shocked everyone, including the German High Command. Guderian refused to stop. His superiors ordered him to halt and consolidate his gains, to wait for infantry to secure his flanks, to build up supplies before continuing. Consolidation was sound military practice. It was also exactly what the French needed to recover. Guderian threatened to resign. When General Ewald von Kleist flew to his headquarters to enforce the stop order, Guderian offered his resignation on the spot. The confrontation was smoothed over with a compromise. Guderian received permission for what was called a reconnaissance in force. He interpreted this authorization as permission to continue his full advance. His tanks drove west at a pace that terrified both enemies and allies. By May 20th, just 7 days after crossing the Meuse, Guderian's forces reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They had travelled over 250 kilometres through enemy territory, cutting the Allied armies in two. The British Expeditionary Force and large portions of the French army were trapped in a pocket around Dunkirk. The rest of France lay open before the German advance. Guderian's Panzer Corps alone captured over 250,000 prisoners during the campaign. France, which had bled for 4 years in the First World War without decisive result, fell in 6 weeks. The German General Staff watched in disbelief at what their radical subordinate had accomplished. The word blitzkrieg entered the vocabulary of warfare, lightning war. The principle was simple, even if the execution was extraordinarily difficult. Concentrate your armour, strike fast and deep. Bypass strong points that will fall anyway once their supply lines are cut. Maintain momentum at all costs. Never give the enemy time to react, to reorganize, to think. Keep hitting until they collapse. Guderian's success in France led to even greater responsibilities on the Eastern Front. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Guderian commanded Panzer Group II, later redesignated 2nd Panzer Army, as part of Army Group Center driving toward Moscow. The opening months of Operation Barbarossa produced victories that dwarfed even France. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 resulted in what German records claimed was 665,000 Soviet prisoners, though historians have since disputed this figure as propagandistic exaggeration, with estimates ranging from 450,000 to the official German count. Even at the lower figure, it remained the largest encirclement in military history. But the Eastern Front also revealed the limits of blitzkrieg. The distances were too vast. The Soviet Union had depth that France lacked. Destroyed armies were replaced by new armies, captured territory stretched supply lines to the breaking point, and the Russian winter arrived before Moscow could be taken. When the Soviets counterattacked in December 1941, Hitler ordered his forces to stand fast, to hold every position regardless of tactical sense. Guderian refused to pass the order to his subordinates. He made unauthorized withdrawals to save his troops from encirclement. On Christmas Day, 1941, he was dismissed from command. It was not the last time Guderian would clash with Hitler. Reinstated in 1943 as Inspector General of Armored Troops, he argued against Operation Citadel, the massive offensive at Kursk that Hitler demanded. "Why are we attacking in the east at all this year?" Guderian asked. Hitler admitted the offensive made his stomach turn over, but proceeded anyway. The result was catastrophic defeat. After the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, Guderian was appointed Chief of the Army General Staff, a position that put him in direct daily contact with an increasingly delusional dictator. His relationship with Hitler deteriorated rapidly as he tried to present realistic assessments of Germany's deteriorating military situation. Guderian argued for withdrawals to defensible positions. Hitler demanded that every inch of ground be held. Guderian proposed concentration of forces at critical points. Hitler insisted on defending everywhere simultaneously. Guderian warned that the Eastern Front was collapsing. Hitler blamed defeatism and demanded counterattacks with divisions that existed only on paper. On February 13, 1945, their confrontation reached a climax during a Berlin Chancellery meeting. Guderian argued vehemently for the evacuation of German forces from Courland, a pocket in Latvia that was being wasted for no strategic purpose. Hitler raged at him, shaking his fists so close to the general's face that an aide physically pulled Guderian backward to prevent him being struck. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Guderian later wrote that he thought Hitler might have a stroke during the argument. Their final break came on March 28, 1945, when Hitler sent Guderian on what he called 6 weeks convalescent leave. The real reason was clear to everyone. Guderian had been too honest about the hopelessness of Germany's position. He had told Hitler truths that no one around the dictator dared to speak. His dismissal may have saved his life. Generals who remained in Berlin were either killed in the final battle or committed suicide in the bunker alongside their leader. The war ended before the leave did. Across the Atlantic, a parallel journey had been unfolding for decades. George Patton Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, to a family with deep military traditions. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel mortally wounded at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864, dying of his wounds 6 days later. Military glory was the family religion. Patton's path to becoming America's premier tank commander began in November 1917, when he became the first American officer assigned to the Tank Corps. The timing was significant. Tanks had been in combat for barely a year. Doctrine barely existed. Everything was being invented on the battlefield. On December 1st, 1917, Patton travelled to Albert, France, approximately 30 miles from Cambrai, where he met with Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, the British Tank Corps Chief of Staff. Fuller briefed Patton on the results of the Battle of Cambrai, the first large-scale tank engagement in history. Nearly 400 British tanks had broken through German lines on November 20th, advancing further in one morning than months of infantry assault had achieved. The meeting changed everything for Patton. Fuller explained his theories of concentrated armoured assault, of using tanks not as infantry support but as the decisive arm of battle, Patton absorbed the ideas like a man dying of thirst, finally finding water. He had found his calling. Patton established the first American tank school at Langres, France. He trained the first American tank crews, developing techniques and tactics from scratch. In September 1918, he led tanks into combat at Saint-Mihiel, the first major American offensive of the war. 3 weeks later, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Patton was wounded while leading his tanks on foot when the vehicles became bogged down in mud. The wound nearly killed him. A bullet passed through his thigh, nicking the femoral artery. He survived only because he applied a tourniquet himself while lying in a shell hole. By the time he recovered, the war was over. Peace did not end Patton's obsession with armored warfare. At Camp Meade, Maryland, in 1919 and 1920, he found a kindred spirit in a young infantry officer named Dwight David Eisenhower. Together they experimented with tanks, tearing them apart to understand their mechanics, developing theories for using armor in mass formations to achieve breakthroughs and carry out flanking attacks. They wrote articles for military journals, they gave lectures, they pushed ideas that seemed revolutionary to an army that had already reverted to peacetime thinking and peacetime budgets. The tank corps had been abolished. Tanks were assigned to the infantry, where they would support foot soldiers rather than operate independently. The army establishment did not appreciate their enthusiasm. Major General Charles Farnsworth, the chief of infantry, called their ideas not only wrong but dangerous. He threatened both officers with court-martial if they continued publishing views incompatible with solid infantry doctrine. The message was clear: shut up or face consequences. Patton transferred to the cavalry, where he could at least maintain some connection to mobile warfare. Eisenhower moved to other assignments. The American armored warfare movement went quiet for nearly 2 decades, but Patton never stopped thinking about tanks. He never stopped reading, studying, preparing for a war he knew would come. He watched the German campaigns in Poland and France with obsessive attention. He understood what Guderian had accomplished because he had been developing similar ideas for over 2 decades. The methods were different, the resources were different, the national contexts were different, but the core principles were identical: speed, concentration, audacity, relentless forward momentum. Harry Yide, the military historian who researched captured German records for his book Fighting Patton, noted that Patton's style of commanding comes close to the German concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders. Tell subordinates what to accomplish and let them figure out how. Patton expressed the same idea in his own words. Never tell people how to do things, he said. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. The tragedy for Patton was that the American army did not want to hear it. The United States entered the Second World War with an armored doctrine that satisfied almost no one. American tanks were designed to exploit breakthroughs made by infantry, not to create breakthroughs themselves. Specialized tank destroyers were supposed to fight enemy tanks while the tanks themselves supported foot soldiers. It was exactly the kind of dispersed, defensive thinking that Guderian and Patton both despised. Patton would have to prove his theories the hard way, in combat, against enemies who had already mastered the methods he advocated. His first major test came in Sicily in July 1943. The invasion plan assigned the Americans to a supporting role, while British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery drove for the key objective of Messina at the island's northeastern tip. Patton was supposed to protect Montgomery's flank and secure airfields. He had other ideas. When the initial landings succeeded better than expected, Patton saw an opportunity. Rather than waiting passively on Montgomery's flank, he pivoted his forces and drove northwest toward Palermo. His 3rd Infantry Division covered 100 miles in 72 hours, an advance rate that shocked observers accustomed to the grinding pace of North African warfare. Patton used 3 amphibious end runs to bypass German defensive positions, landing troops behind enemy lines to cut off retreat routes before the defenders knew what was happening. He captured Palermo on July 22nd, and then raced east along the coast road toward Messina. Montgomery, methodically grinding through German defences in the mountainous terrain of eastern Sicily, watched the American upstart sprint past him. Patton arrived in Messina hours before the British, securing the city on August 17th. The campaign had revealed both his brilliance and his flaws. His aggressive tactics had shortened the campaign considerably, but his focus on the race to Messina allowed approximately 100,000 Axis soldiers to evacuate to mainland Italy, where they would fight again. The Sicily campaign also nearly destroyed his career. In 2 separate incidents at evacuation hospitals, Patton slapped soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, accusing them of cowardice. When the incidents became public, the outcry was enormous. Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander of Allied forces, privately reprimanded Patton and expressed serious doubts about his future usefulness. Patton was effectively sidelined for 11 months, while the war continued without him. The Germans, ironically, paid little attention to these events. Yeide's research in captured German military records found no indication that German commanders in Tunisia even knew who Patton was during the early campaigns. A February 1944 German Air War Academy paper profiling Allied invasion generals included Bradley and Montgomery, but omitted Patton entirely. The man who would become their most feared opponent was barely on their radar. That was about to change dramatically. When Patton returned to active command in January 1944, the Allies gave him a phantom army. The first United States Army group existed only on paper, a deception operation code named Fortitude, designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion of France would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Patton was the bait. The Germans knew his reputation for aggressive action. If Patton was positioned near Calais, with what appeared to be a massive army, surely that was where the real invasion would fall. Normandy must be a diversion. The deception worked beyond all expectations, even after D-Day on June 6, 1944. Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a feint. The German 15th Army, approximately 150,000 men, stayed at Pas-de-Calais for 7 weeks, waiting for Patton's attack. Those troops might have thrown the Normandy invasion back into the sea if committed in the first days. Instead, they waited for an assault that never came. On August 1st, 1944, Patton finally received what he had waited his entire career to command. The 3rd United States Army became operational, and Patton was unleashed. The timing was perfect. Operation Cobra had finally broken the German lines in Normandy after weeks of bloody fighting in the hedgerow country. American forces had been grinding forward at terrible cost, sometimes advancing only a few hundred yards per day against determined German resistance in terrain that favoured the defence. But now there was a gap in the German lines, and Patton drove through it like Guderian through Sedan. At Avranches, the entire Third Army funneled through a single narrow corridor. 7 divisions crossed the bridge at Pontaubou in 72 hours, approximately 100,000 soldiers and 15,000 vehicles pouring through a choke point that should have been a death trap. German aircraft tried to destroy the bridge. German forces launched Operation Lüttich, a desperate counterattack aimed at cutting the corridor and trapping the American forces that had passed through. Neither succeeded. Patton pushed troops through faster than anyone believed possible. Then he did something that would have made Guderian proud. Instead of advancing on a single axis toward a single objective, Patton attacked in 4 directions simultaneously. He sent forces south to secure the Loire River line. He sent forces west into the Brittany Peninsula to capture ports. He sent forces north toward the Falaise pocket where German armies were being encircled, and he sent forces east toward Paris and the German border. This was blitzkrieg in everything but name: speed, concentration at the decisive point, relentless forward movement, accepting risk on the flanks to maintain momentum at the point of attack. Patton covered 200 miles from Avranches to the Seine River in approximately 3 weeks. His units advanced so fast that they frequently overran German headquarters before the occupants knew Americans were in the area. Third Army's partnership with the 19th Tactical Air Command under General Otto Wieland multiplied its effectiveness beyond anything ground forces alone could achieve. In the first operational month, August 1944, the 19th T AEC flew 12,000 fighter-bomber sorties. In direct support of Patton's advance, German columns caught on the roads were annihilated from the air. German reinforcements never reached the front. German commanders could not move by daylight without risking destruction from above. The dash across France ended, not because the Germans stopped it, but because Third Army ran out of fuel on August 31st. The Allied supply system, still dependent on the Normandy beaches and the port of Cherbourg, could not keep pace with Patton's advance. He had outrun his logistics just as Guderian had outrun his logistics in Russia in 1941. Eisenhower made a decision that Patton never forgave. Fuel and supplies were diverted to Montgomery's forces in the north for Operation Market Garden, an ambitious airborne assault into the Netherlands that ultimately failed. Patton received, by his own accounting, only a fraction of what he needed to continue his advance. Third Army ground to a halt within sight of the German border, its tanks empty. What followed was the Lorraine campaign, and it revealed the limits of mobile warfare when momentum has been lost and resources are constrained. The fortified city of Metz had not fallen to assault since 1870, when the Prussians captured it during the Franco-Prussian War. Its ring of massive concrete forts, built by the Germans during their 47-year occupation and designed to withstand the heaviest artillery of the era, represented exactly the kind of obstacle that blitzkrieg doctrine was designed to bypass entirely. Patton could not bypass Metz. His supply situation prevented the sweeping maneuvers he preferred. Third Army was reduced to the kind of grinding infantry offensive that both Patton and Guderian despised, exactly the type of attritional warfare that mobile doctrine was supposed to prevent. The fighting around Metz was brutal. Fort Driant, a massive concrete fortification on the city's western outskirts, became the only battle Patton ever lost. American infantry assaulted the fort repeatedly, pouring into tunnels and casemates, fighting room to room against determined German defenders who knew every inch of the complex. After 2 weeks of bloody combat that cost 64 killed, over 500 wounded, and nearly 200 captured, Patton ordered a withdrawal. The fort had held. The city of Metz finally surrendered on November 22, 1944, but the last outlying forts did not fall until December 13th. Third Army suffered approximately 55,000 casualties during the Lorraine campaign, roughly 40% of its total European war losses. The price of fighting without mobility, without supplies, without the initiative was measured in blood. General Hermann Balck, commanding Army Group G against Third Army during Lorraine, later offered a critical assessment. "Within my zone," he wrote, "the Americans never once exploited a success. Often my chief of staff and I would stand in front of the map and say, 'Patton is helping us. He failed to exploit another success.' But Balck was describing a Patton fighting with one hand tied behind his back, starved of fuel and ammunition by decisions made above his level. When Patton had the resources for mobile warfare, the results were dramatically different. Then came the Ardennes. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched their last major offensive in the West. Hitler threw 3 armies, over 200,000 men, through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The target was the port of Antwerp. If the Germans could capture it, they would split the Allied armies and potentially force a negotiated peace. The attack achieved complete surprise. American units were overwhelmed by German forces attacking under cover of bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction where 7 roads met, was surrounded by German forces on December 21st. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units held the town against repeated German assaults, their commander responding to a surrender demand with the single word, "nuts." 2 days after the German offensive began, on December 18th, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders at Verdun. The situation was grim. American forces were reeling. The bulge in the Allied lines threatened to become a breakthrough. Something had to be done quickly to halt the German advance and relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take to disengage 3rd Army from its current operations facing east, pivot 90 degrees north, and counterattack the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton's answer stunned the room. 48 hours, he said. He could have 2 divisions attacking the day after tomorrow morning. British officers laughed. Senior American commanders showed visible skepticism. What Patton was proposing seemed impossible by any conventional military standard. 3rd Army was engaged along a front of approximately 100 miles, attacking eastward toward the German border. Turning an entire army 90 degrees and launching an offensive in a completely different direction was not something that could be done in 2 days. It usually took weeks of planning, coordination, and logistical preparation. What none of them knew was that Patton had anticipated exactly this crisis. Before the meeting, he had ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for responding to the German offensive. Each plan was complete with march routes, assembly areas, supply arrangements, and attack orders. All Patton needed to do was call his headquarters with a code phrase identifying which plan to execute. The call went out that evening. The code was playball. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in the history of warfare. 3rd Army executed a 90-degree pivot, moving over 133,000 vehicles more than 100 miles through winter conditions, over icy roads, in bitter cold, with German forces attacking from the north. Units broke contact with the enemy on one front, marched through the night without rest, and attacked on a new front without pause. On December 26th, precisely on schedule, precisely as Patton had promised, the 4th Armoured Division broke through German lines and relieved the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the lead tank battalion, punched through the final German positions in the late afternoon. By evening, the first supply trucks were rolling into Bastogne. The siege was broken. The operation had required 3rd Army to move 6 divisions over 100 miles in less than 72 hours through winter weather at night while maintaining combat readiness. Units that disengaged from the enemy at dusk were expected to be attacking new objectives by dawn 2 days later. Staff officers who had studied military logistics said it could not be done. Patton's army did it anyway. The fighting in the Bulge continued for weeks. Patton's forces did not simply relieve Bastogne and stop. They attacked northward, pressing the Germans back, reducing the Bulge that gave the battle its name. By the end of January 1945, the German offensive had been completely eliminated. The Wehrmacht had shot its last bolt in the west, The forces expended in the Ardennes would be desperately needed to defend the Rhine, and they were gone. The Germans, who faced Third Army in the Ardennes, understood what they were seeing. Patton was using their own methods against them. The speed, the audacity, the willingness to take risks that would paralyze a more cautious commander. It was blitzkrieg turned against its inventors. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, considered Patton a far more dangerous opponent than Montgomery. Von Rundstedt described the British Field Marshal as overly cautious, habit-ridden, and systematic. Blumentritt illustrated the contrast by mimicking Montgomery's methodical approach, taking very deliberate and short steps, putting his foot down heavily each time. Patton fought differently. He fought like they did. He understood the same principles. He executed the same methods. He achieved the same results. The final proof came in March 1945. Montgomery was preparing Operation Plunder, an elaborate crossing of the Rhine River with massive artillery preparation, airborne landings, and carefully rehearsed infantry assault. It was scheduled for March 23rd and 24th. On March 22nd, the night before Montgomery's great set-piece battle commenced, Patton's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. They encountered virtually no opposition. The crossing was made without artillery preparation, without air support, without any of the elaborate preparations Montgomery deemed necessary. Patton had stolen a march on the entire British army. The phone call to Bradley became legendary. "Brad, do not tell anyone," Patton said, "but I am across." There was a pause. "I sneaked a division over last night." By the next morning, 2 more divisions were crossing. Within 48 hours, Patton had bridgeheads on the east bank of the Rhine that Montgomery's elaborate preparations had failed to secure more quickly, despite weeks of planning. The German defenders were too weak and too surprised to stop the American flood. Third Army drove deep into Germany during the final weeks of the war. Patton's forces captured Frankfurt. They liberated the concentration camp at Ohrdruf, the first Nazi camp encountered by American soldiers, on April 4, 1945. The horrors they found there shocked even battle-hardened veterans. Patton personally toured the camp and ordered every American soldier in the area to see what the Nazis had done, so that no one could later claim ignorance. The advance continued through Bavaria and into Austria and Czechoslovakia. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Third Army had penetrated further east than any other American unit. By war's end, Third Army had compiled a record that justified every claim its commander made and silenced every critic who doubted his methods. In 281, continuous days of combat from August 1, 1944 to May 9, 1945, Third Army captured over 81,000 square miles of territory. They crossed 24 major rivers. They liberated over 12,000 cities, towns, and communities. They captured 27 cities with populations exceeding 50,000. The prisoner counts were staggering by any historical standard. Third Army captured 765,000 prisoners during active combat operations. After the German surrender, they processed an additional 515,000. The total exceeded 1,280,000 prisoners of war, more than the entire strength of the Wehrmacht at the end of the war. Third Army's own casualties, according to the official after-action report, were approximately 16,000 killed, 96,000 wounded, and 27,000 missing or captured. Military historian J.F.C. Fuller, analysing the campaign with conservative estimates of enemy losses, calculated an approximate kill ratio of 1.75 to 1 in favour of Third Army. The contrast between Third Army's mobile warfare in August 1944 and January 1945 versus the attritional fighting in Lorraine demonstrated Patton's core argument about how wars should be fought. When he had the resources for manoeuvre, his casualties were low and his gains were enormous. When he was forced into positional warfare, casualties mounted and progress slowed. The lesson was clear to anyone willing to see it. Mobile warfare saved lives on the winning side while destroying the enemy's capacity to resist. Guderian watched none of this unfold. He had been dismissed as chief of the German General Staff on March 28, 1945, sent away by Hitler just weeks before the final collapse. By the time American interrogators sat him down and asked about Patton, Germany lay in ruins, and Guderian was a prisoner. His assessment of Patton was not mere flattery designed to please his captors. It was professional recognition from one master of mobile warfare to another. Patton had demonstrated every principle that Guderian held sacred: speed over caution, concentration over dispersion, audacity over methodical preparation, momentum over consolidation, decision over deliberation. The two men had arrived at these conclusions independently through parallel development. There is no evidence that Patton ever read Achtung Panzer. The book was not translated into English until 1992, nearly 5 decades after the war ended. What Patton absorbed of German doctrine came through translated texts, through careful observation of German campaigns in newsreels and intelligence reports, and through his own decades of thinking about how tanks should fight. The parallel development is what makes the comparison so remarkable. Guderian did not teach Patton. Patton did not imitate Guderian. Two men, shaped by similar experiences in the First World War, wrestling with similar problems about how to avoid another generation of slaughter, reached identical conclusions about the nature of modern warfare. When they finally fought on opposite sides of history's greatest conflict, one of them won and one of them lost, but both recognized in the other a kindred spirit. Patton's career ended in controversy, as it had so often been marked by controversy during the war itself. After Germany's surrender, he was appointed military governor of Bavaria. His administration was troubled from the start. He resisted denazification policies that he considered impractical, making increasingly impolitic statements that embarrassed the American occupation government. During a September 22, 1945 press conference, Patton compared Nazi Party membership to a Democrat-Republican election fight, suggesting that most Nazis had joined for career advancement rather than ideological commitment. The comparison was politically tone-deaf in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust's full revelation. The outcry was immediate and fierce. Eisenhower summoned Patton to a heated confrontation. On October 7, 1945, Patton was relieved of 3rd Army Command and transferred to the 15th Army, a paper organization of fewer than 4,000 personnel whose mission was compiling the official history of the war. It was a deliberate humiliation, a general's version of being sent to count paperclips in a basement office. 2 months later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's car was struck by a truck near Mannheim, Germany. The collision broke his neck and left him paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, he died from complications including pulmonary edema and a blood clot. He was 60 years old. Guderian survived the war by almost a decade. He was captured by American forces in May 1945 and held until 1948, cooperating with Allied interrogators and military historians who sought to understand how Germany had conquered Europe and how that conquest had ultimately failed. He spent his final years writing his memoirs, published in German in 1950 and translated into English as Panzer Leader in 1952. The book became a classic of military literature studied in staff colleges around the world. Guderian died on May 14, 1954, at the age of 65. He and Patton never met. They never exchanged a word. They never faced each other across a battlefield, yet they understood each other more completely than most men who spend lifetimes in conversation. The lessons of their parallel careers extend far beyond military history. Both men saw something that their contemporaries could not see. Both faced institutional resistance to their ideas from establishments committed to outdated methods. Both were dismissed, sidelined, threatened, punished for being right before their time, and both were ultimately vindicated by events that proved their theories correct. When Guderian said Patton fought as he would have fought, he was acknowledging something profound about the nature of military genius. Across the divide of nations and armies and ideologies, two warriors had found the same truth about their craft. The recognition was mutual, even if only one could articulate it after the war ended. The principles they shared did not originate with either of them. Fuller and Liddell Hart wrote about concentrated armoured assault before Guderian or Patton achieved high command, but theorizing about warfare and practicing it successfully against enemies who are trying to kill you are very different things. Guderian and Patton proved the theories in the unforgiving laboratory of actual combat, transforming ideas into victories. Concentrate your forces at the decisive point. Strike fast and deep before the enemy can react. Maintain momentum even at the risk of exposed flanks. Never give your opponent time to recover his balance. These principles remain relevant wherever conflict occurs, in military affairs and beyond. The German generals who faced Patton recognized what they were seeing because they had helped create the methods he employed. The American had learned their approach, whether from studying their campaigns or from his own parallel reasoning, and he had used that knowledge to defeat them. There is perhaps no greater tribute one warrior can pay another than to say, "You fight as I would fight." Guderian paid that tribute to Patton. In doing so, he admitted something remarkable. The Americans had produced a general worthy of genuine respect. Not because of superior resources, though America had those in abundance, but because of superior understanding of how mobile warfare should be conducted. Patton would have appreciated the compliment. He had spent his entire adult life preparing to fight exactly this kind of war. The recognition from the man who invented blitzkrieg would have meant more to him than any medal or promotion. History separated them by nationality, language, and circumstance. But in the realm of military thought and practice, they were brothers who never met. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us bring you more accounts from military history that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with stories of remarkable individuals who shaped the conflicts of the 20th century. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, united by a shared interest in understanding how wars are fought and won, and why some commanders achieve greatness while others are forgotten. Thank you for watching.